Hello, I'm Glenn Fleishman. I'm the editor of the upcoming book, Go Computer Now, a book about the history of the Sphere computer and the company that made it. You might know me from such other books as Shift Happens, A History of Keyboards, and this book, like Shift Happens, is being crowdfunded on Kickstarter, and I have with me the author of the book, the person who hired me to edit it, Ben Zotto. Hello, Ben.
Hey, Glenn. It's good to be here with you.
Welcome to your own podcast and videocast.
It is a pleasure.
Ben, I invited you on your own show because I wanted to talk to you about what made Sphere tick. I mean, we met a year ago when you had a manuscript ready to go, and my first reaction was I was flabbergasted because I owned a computer in the late 70s. I worked with those early computers. I've read a lot of these books that are out there, and you said Sphere, and I said, what? So why haven't we heard of Sphere before?
We should have heard of Sphere before, and there are a couple things that I think happened there. One is that like many of the late 70s computers, the Spheres were manufactured in relatively smaller quantities. So maybe 10% of the Altairs that were made, were produced of the Spheres. Histories of these things are fundamentally, a historian would say, are contested, which is to say that there are always alternative narratives. And the story that we have today of the early microcomputer era really started coalescing in the early 1980s. There were a series of kind of important books that came out, and the Sphere was written out of most of those histories, in part because I think it was a sort of like an odd or maybe a bit unloved in its time, but also because history tends to be written by people who either are successful or who talk a lot about their accomplishments. And the Sphere was sort of neither. And so it ended up being kind of left out of these written histories. And so ever since that coalesced, we're still here without really knowing about this important machine.
Yeah, and I mean, people from that era who we talk about still are, we talk about Steve Jobs, we talk about Bill Gates, and then not lesser people, but sort of their colleagues. We talk about Paul Allen and Wozniak, and there's a lot of other names that come up. We also remember Ed Roberts, who was the founder of MITS, that made, some of the, or arguably the earliest computer you could buy from a kit and put together and it would work. But the Sphere was something different. We remember Ed Roberts maybe because of the Microsoft connection, since Paul Allen and Bill Gates worked for him, and he was interviewed every time there was a Microsoft anniversary. But I think Sphere had some different unique aspects to it. One of which is it wasn't built in Silicon Valley. It wasn't built in New York City, for instance. Where was Sphere created?
Sphere was created in the town of Bountiful, Utah, and it's a small community. It's a sort of small city, 15, 20 minutes north of Salt Lake City. And that is, as you allude to, it was not a hotbed of computer technology. There were, to Salt Lake City's credit, there were a couple important universities, University of Utah and BYU, had early computer programs. And Evans and Sutherland, the early graphics firm, is out of Utah. But outside of that, there really wasn't a hub of computing or hacking in the way that you would find the way that you found in Silicon Valley in the early 70s, mid 70s, and late 70s. And we do remember, Ed Roberts from MITS. And in all fairness, MITS was in Albuquerque. They were not in Silicon Valley either, but they were, as you say, kind of first out of the gate. And so everybody kind of knew who MITS was and knew who the Altair was. The guy who founded Sphere was a guy named Mike Wise, and he sort of stopped taking classes at BYU because he sort of graduated himself onto working jobs, which were more interesting to him to get more experience with computing. And he spent the rest of it after Sphere. He spent the rest of his life and career in Utah. And so his story never kind of got recirculated in the computer history world.
Right. And I think, another factor that I garnered from reading the book is that this is a tight-knit community he was in. Sphere existed from, about 1975 to 1977 or so. Maybe they shipped 1,000 or more computers in kit and other forms. And then the people involved, some of them didn't get their last paychecks. Some suppliers were unpaid. Might have been embarrassing in the community they were in. And it feels like nobody had a reason to brag about Sphere except Mike Wise, who wanted to be remembered for things that he felt were unique or that other people had, frankly, he thought had stolen from him or at least heavily borrowed. Mike unfortunately passed away almost 25 years ago, so you're relying on other people's recollections of him. But tell us about that computer he created, why should we remember the Sphere computer? Or I know there were many models, but at least the first one that came out of the gate in kit and then assembled form.
Yeah, it took Mike's ideas about how mini computers worked, what mainframes were used to. He had experience with the IBM System 360 and 370, as well as a series of DEC mini computers. And his conception was a sort of modular system that could be affordable and low cost, essentially, with I think maybe the term he used, and could exist on an individual's desktop. And that was, in some sense, that was also true of the Altair. But the way that he conceptualized it was a system that was useful to do real work with from the moment that you owned it or turned it on. And so
you turned it on, and you got a prompt.
Yeah, there was a built-in suite of tools, you'd say. They called it the program development system, and it was a sort of integrated firmware. It was not especially user-friendly, so I don't want to overplay how extensive it was. It was a remarkable compression of functionality into a tiny amount of program space, but it incorporated a full screen-based cursor editor, a debugger, and a mini assembler, all within the same firmware. It's astonishing, actually, what it can do relative to other small computers of its time.
Yeah, I mean, I bought my first computer that I owned was an Ohio Scientific C1P. Forget I can't remember the name of what the C stood for. It was one port. It was it had 8K of RAM and 8K of ROM, and the Sphere wasn't much behind it. It had 1K of ROM and 4K of RAM, even though the OSI was years later. Mm-hmm. The Sphere was less powerful, but my machine came with a keyboard built in, but it booted to a prompt. It didn't come with a monitor. I had to attach a monitor through an external thing. Sphere, to me, even in 79 or 80, I think would have seemed pretty cool. Maybe not as sophisticated as machines that were available, but as you investigated this, you kind of felt like you had a driving question, which was, we haven't heard of it. Most people haven't heard of Sphere, even people who have studied the era, people like me who grew up during that time and maybe tried or went to computer stores, saw a lot of computers. You've got this goal of memory, it feels like you want to make sure Sphere isn't forgotten. Why is that? What has compelled you to write a book? And I should say, maybe about a 350-page book when it's the design is done, something in that range. What was the driving factor that led you here?
Recognizing that I had come across, and the story of how I came across it, I could spin out into something longer, but essentially I found a discarded Sphere computer in parts out on the sidewalk, and it was somebody kind of tossed it out in the way that sometimes people do in cities.
So funny.
And, I kind of brought it home, and that began this research project. And realizing that I'd found something that had kind of fallen through the temporal cracks of this history made me realize that these people in Bountiful who worked on this innovative and early and I think important system had just been sort of disappeared from the history. So for me, the idea was to kind of bring to light this story, to contest the history, as you'd say, to tell this story against the backdrop of the existing micro revolution in those years, 75 to 77 or so, as we already know it, and to show how the Sphere really fits into this story in ways that will, I think, surprise readers. It shows up in the Homebrew Computer Club. It shows up, in Steve Wozniak's memory, in Bill Gates's memory, and that stuff is kind of unexpected, I think, unless you realize that it's there.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this as Mike Wise was brilliant and difficult and ambitious and maybe a bad manager of money and people, but also way ahead of his time. He really saw into the future, but he was kind of a Forrest Gump figure at one level. Like if you go back through history, you'll find a picture of him in the background or someone from Sphere traveling in every important thing that happened between 75 and maybe 77. Sphere had its fingers in it. They were there, they're a major advertiser in Byte. People found out about him because one of the earliest computer stores that exists was selling them. was talking to someone the day and they said, oh yeah, they had a sphere that was being sold at a store near where I lived, where I grew up then. So it's kind of like this parallel history, like a thing fell into from another universe, but then you start digging and you find it. Now, a lot of people have come across stories that I don't think are as compelling and deep as this one. I mean, this fills a very big gap in my mind in an aspect of personal computer history and that sort of revolution. If you omit these folks, you don't know that you omitted them, and now we've found about them. But I would say, a lot of people who've come across stories they find compelling, they'll often say, well, I'm going to do a long YouTube video. I'm going to do a 35-minute, 5-hour, whatever video about this. They might write a long blog post, and then people are interested, they write more. You'll remember that Shift Happen started in part because Marcin Wichary wandered into a typewriting museum in Spain and posted a lot of pictures on Twitter, and people went berserk. So, why write an entire, full-length book about this? Why not do a blog post or make a YouTube video?
It's a great question, and my answer to that sort of reveals a little bit of an old-fashioned tendency, I think, in myself. I mean, essentially, a couple of reasons. One, there's enough story. There was enough story for a book. Even one of the Sphere employees said to me, "I don't understand. Do you you think you're going to make there's a book here?" And I said, "Believe me, there is." And as I kept talking to people, there's more and more material, and it threads more and more into the existing kind of microhistory. So I realized there's a book there. But more importantly, or more fundamentally, books are still how our history is recorded. And I am an admirer, I've always been an admirer of these sort of foundational computing history books, Fire in the Valley, Michael Morris's The Little Kingdom. They're this sort of series of important books that are mined for historic material by others, including myself, and producing something that can sit alongside those volumes in the sort of bookshelf of computing history in a way that will not disappear with a web page or with a video hosting provider. There's something more durable about the construction of a book with careful citations, meticulous sourcing, that I hope, I've structured it, and with your help, Glenn, I've structured it in a way that I believe is a compelling story to read. But I also have this goal of having it be a resource for others to use later. I really do want the Sphere story to become part of the canon of early microhistory.
Yeah, I think I've served people listening or watching, and yourself and I have all encountered stories where they are kind of thin and they're stretched a little too far for what's available. And in your case, of course, as your editor, I know we started with a larger manuscript and had to pull out some interesting stuff that just didn't make the cut to make it a tighter story that was more compelling in that form. And I'm sure you'll have other stories to tell about Sphere after the book comes out as well. But I think it's important to mention, one of the things I was excited about when I first spoke to you, and you're like, I haven't written a book before, here's a book. And by the way, I've interviewed 40 people. I was like, oh, okay, so this is a real thing. This isn't, I started listening to a podcast a few weeks ago that sounded like a very interesting topic. I was in comics and a historical thing. I start listening, and after a little bit, I'm like, oh, these people didn't do any research. They're kind of reading somebody else's book or article and citing it and reinterpreting it. So there's nothing primary here. So that's fine. They're retelling a story, but it didn't have that authoritative tone to it. And I could tell. We've all read books where someone is entirely reliant on second or third hand sources. So it kind of feels stitched together and incomplete because there's nothing authentic. They weren't able to go and get the direct voice of people involved, or even primary documents, relying on people talking about other documents. You did a lot of research for this book, and that doesn't make a book a good book, but I would say this is a good book. And of course I'm biased, but it's, you spoke to so many people involved in this. Do you feel this makes a difference in how you approach the book and what you wrote? I mean, would you have written this book if you hadn't been able to track down so many interview subjects who were involved in this?
It was, first of all, it was a pleasure to do that. I mean, I love talking to interesting people, and I also, there were essentially almost all the people I spoke to had not been asked to share the story of this part of their lives or careers ever, and so being sort of kind of blessed with the opportunity, essentially, of being a person to capture that. It's a responsibility. It gives you kind of responsibility. So, I I would, I don't know, would I have done something different if I had just found a sphere and it had been well documented? I don't know, maybe I would have come up with some more insights by tinkering around with it and put up some blog posts, and that kind of would be the end of it. But I kind of realized that there was this kind of like vast interconnected untold story. And like some of the things that you had to help me cut out of the book were adjacent to the core sphere story, but are themselves also sort of these untold early micro era stories. And it's almost like there's this kind of, we're all used to the story of the early days of Apple and how the Homebrew Computer Club worked and how that kind of gave us and begat these other things. But there's this sort of all this underworld of like untold spider webs that connect across and through of early micro program software distribution. There's a whole kind of piece about that Sphere ended up being kind of instrumental to, just kind of almost by coincidence, to your kind of Forrest Gump note before. It really does seem like, there's this great quotation it shows up in different forms, but they always say this about the band, the Velvet Underground, which is a phenomenal band and didn't famously sell a whole lot of albums, but they're very influential. And the quote was all, Lou Reed, somebody else said it first, but then Lou Reed says, well, there's a joke that, we didn't sell that many records, but everybody who bought it went out and started a band. And there's this idea that, Sphere shows up in these really sort of like influential moments in this early micro era. And even some of the people, so the story I tell is about the company and the computer, but it's also about the community of users. And I think that's that's a bit of a unique spin on a computer history. Because the user community was relatively small and relatively tight knit, they kind of become part of the story. They're like Sphere, the company and computer also incorporates this set of users who help them like build the machine basically and help them make it useful, and then existed beyond the time.
People who got very interested were often hired by Sphere to work for Sphere because they needed somebody who had that degree of obsession to help other customers.
Yeah, in a couple cases, yes. Yeah. And then certainly there were some key users who ended up providing kind of like a whole chunk of the software that everybody used, because they were so into that system. And so telling that, sort of threading that all through, and then telling how some of those people went off to become sort of legendary in their own fields, but cut their teeth on the Sphere. Yeah. And that kind of, so there are all these kind of interesting tendrils that kind of run through it.
Well, I think that's a great case to be made for this book is that, no one is going to come to your book and go, I'm very interested in Sphere, a company I've never heard of before, because they've never heard of it before. But I think it's a compelling story because it's a story about Mike Wise, the main mover, the founder, and who brought this together and who had incredible vision. And, we love flawed people. We love people with great ambition and great abilities who then also maybe can't achieve them. And, Mike Wise never got a second act, really, although one of the companies he founded after Sphere continues to exist in a very different form today, which is cool. I love that he's not totally forgotten and the people there remember him still. But, it's sort of a story about what did we forget? What is forgotten, and what was the incredible innovation that was happening in that time? Here's yet another, I think, very interesting story about people in a place that's so far from Silicon Valley in so many ways, people who never got a chance for their story to be told. And when anybody writes a computer history in the future, after your book exists, what I hope is they have to reevaluate Sphere's place, because I know you're not obsessed by firsts. And as we edited the book, we talked about this quite a bit, is that it's not so much that Sphere was first in anything, but they were uniquely positioned and they had a lot of, well, I know there's things that they were.
There are things that are in the air. There are things that there are historic contingencies.
But they pulled a lot together kind of in a unique way at a unique time. And for a little bit of time, it seemed like Sphere, maybe in a different world, could have actually become a big company, or at least, become a Commodore pet, as opposed to something that's been forgotten. So this story is kind of remembering that, but it's also helping people fit together the missing pieces. So the next comprehensive personal computer history story has to put Sphere in its place. It's not an Apple, but boy, it's missing from all the books that we've ever read that cover this era.
That's a good summary. I like the way you said that, and that is one of the values I hope to provide in this book.
Well, I think you've done it, but again, I might be a little biased being the editor on this project. But if people want to get a copy of the book, it's currently in crowdfunding, they can go to sphere.computer, a legitimate domain name, or they can go to Kickstarter and type in "Go Computer Now," which is derived from advertisement that Sphere did that was too compelling to not look at. And if it's after you're watching this, after the campaign is over, that's a possibility. You can still go to sphere.computer and find out more about the Sphere, because Ben has posted information. There's even an emulator where you can go and use the Sphere operating system, just boot to a cursor as if you had a piece of hardware, except that this time it works all the time. The Sphere may be a little bit, you don't need any oscillators to get the emulator to work. Ben, thanks for being on your own podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Glenn.